Ruth was born in a small town as the eldest child in the family. Her younger sister Leela was born 3 years later. 7 years after that, their parents divorced. Sarah's husband was caught cheating publicly, and such news spread across the town swiftly. When Sarah was informed about it by a well-wisher, she turned pale but said nothing and went home. That same evening, the woman brought the girls to spend the night with their grandfather, Sarah's father, while she stayed home waiting for her husband to return from work. As soon as Derek crossed the threshold, he noticed 2 suitcases packed with his belongings and sighed in resignation. "They told you already, huh?" His wife nodded calmly. "Yes, Derek." He shrugged. "I don't know what to say. The devil's got me confused." The woman sighed. "You, Derek, got confused a few months ago. I've noticed the long hair on your clothes, the smell of female perfume, and the change in your attitude towards me. I convinced myself that things would improve, that all men do this, and that I should be patient for the girl's sake. I turned a blind eye for as long as I could. So why don't we wait it out, Sarah?" There was hope in the man's voice. The woman laughed nervously. "After the way you embarrassed me all over town, I can't even look at you right now." Derek swallowed. "What about our daughters? Will you even let me see them?" "Sure, you can see Ruth and Leela as much as you want. Now, go away. I can't stand to see you anymore." Derek sighed but did not argue or persuade. He knew his wife too well. If she had made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. So he picked up his suitcase and left without saying goodbye. Sarah closed the door behind him, stood there for a few seconds, then exhaled deeply and went into her bedroom. She switched on the iron, laid out a blouse on the ironing board, and started ironing. After 2 precise movements, her hands trembled. She put the iron aside, slid down the wall, and quietly sobbed. The woman came to her father's the next morning. She looked pale with dark circles under her eyes, and a small new wrinkle had appeared between her eyebrows. "Girls, I need to talk to you," she said, and then explained to the girls that their father would no longer be living with them. Adjusting to life without their father was challenging. The flat seemed emptier, missing his cheerful morning singing from the bathroom. No one else pretended to be a horse for them and Leela to ride on. Even the coat rack seemed emptier without his jacket. Derek visited his daughters, but he seemed different. The man attempted to engage with them as before, but his efforts appeared insincere, tinged with guilt. These meetings left the girls not with joy, but with a vague anxiety and a sense of impropriety. And then one day, returning home from school, Ruth saw a truck full of boxes, cabinets, chairs, and other items in their yard. Several men were unloading the belongings and taking them into her apartment building. The girls followed them inside and up to her floor. The door to the apartment across was wide open, and the items were being moved in there. "Do we have new neighbors? Have you seen them?" Ruth asked her mother, who was cooking in the kitchen while Leela drew at the table. "Yes, I've seen," replied the woman without turning around. "It seems a young woman and a boy about your age are moving in. We should meet them." But the new neighbors turned out to be quicker in meeting with neighbors. After lunch, the doorbell rang. Sarah went to open it. "We have a very nice neighbor," the mother announced, smiling when she returned to the kitchen. "We're having dinner with them tonight." "Yay, guests!" Leela cheered. Ruth frowned but said nothing. She didn't want strangers in their house, especially boys. She even considered asking for permission to visit her grandfather, but she quickly dismissed the thought. Her mom would certainly not allow it. "Fine," Ruth decided. "I'll spend some time with this boy, then I'll go to my room." After work, Sarah usually felt tired and tried to rest in the evening. She had to check pupils' workbook and write plans for the next lessons. However, today was different. Right after lunch, she finished her teacher's work and began cleaning, involving her daughters. Once they finished cleaning, the woman started cooking. "Is that a raspberry pie with cream cheese cream?" Ruth asked in surprise, noting that her mother usually prepared it only for holidays. Sarah chuckled. I think tonight will be a special night for us. Finally, the doorbell rang. An eager Ruth rushed to open it. Peace be upon this house and its hospitable owners, a young woman greeted from the doorstep. It took Ruth a few moments to understand why her mother was so excited. The new neighbor resembled a pagan goddess of spring and sunshine. She was tall and slender, with long, slightly curly red hair. Her large, bright green eyes twinkled with a smile when she gazed at Ruth. The woman's attire was also unusual. She wore a long, multicolored dress. Her arms were adorned with numerous bracelets made of wooden beads, metal chains, and multicolored threads that matched her dress. My name is Gail, the woman said, her smile compelling Ruth to reciprocate, and this is my son, Connor. Only now did Ruth notice the boy standing behind her. He seemed to be about her age, with hair and eyes reminiscent of his mother's, and was dressed in a plain black t-shirt and blue jeans. He looked at Ruth with a slightly superior smile, as if he was aware of the effect his mother usually had on people. However, he did not come across as arrogant or smug. Ruth suddenly thought that they could become friends. Come on in, Ruth invited them. Gail smiled and stepped into the flat. Mom's in the kitchen, informed Ruth. I'll see you out. Sarah cheerfully greeted her guests. It seemed she had already decided they would be friends. Indeed, anyone would want to befriend the beautiful, vibrant, and cheerful Gail. She gave the impression of carrying a celebration in her pocket, ready to share it and spread joy. Such people are never dull or uninteresting. While the mothers wrapped up dinner preparations, Ruth and Connor retreated to the living room. Leela was already there, engrossed in playing with her dolls. She eyed the new boy with curiosity but remained silent. Ruth realized that as the eldest, it was her responsibility to extend hospitality and entertain their guest. Will you go to our school? Yes, and we can go to school together if you don't mind, Ruth shrugged, pretending not to care. What do you like to do in your spare time after school, for example? I don't know, she answered, a little confused. Sometimes I watch TV. I can read a book or something. The boy nodded. Books are great. I really enjoy reading too. And what about you? Ruth asked, but he made her feel self-conscious because she hadn't previously considered that she should be doing something else except her homework. I collect Lego, replied Connor. Ruth scoffed and said proudly, building sets is for kids. Connor smiled. Aren't we kids? She felt embarrassed again. Technically, he was right, but none of her friends had ever agreed with that sentiment so easily before. They refused to admit that they were still children. Instead, they were always trying to prove to each other that they were already grown up. At that moment, their mother emerged from the kitchen. She carried a platter laden with a salad and lasagna that Gail had prepared. Children, come to the table, Sarah said once everyone was seated. Gail poured white wine into 2 glasses. Connor, Ruth, and Leela filled identical glasses with juice. The red-haired guest stood up, scanned the room, and smiled. My and my son's lives have recently changed, she began. I'm delighted about it. In my opinion, change is always for the better. Let's raise our glasses to change. Sarah echoed enthusiastically. Ruth and Leela looked at their mother rather in surprise. They had grown used to her quiet, calm, stern, and frowning demeanor over the past year, but now, within a few hours, she seemed rejuvenated and full of life. Could it be the influence of their new neighbor? Ruth glanced at Gail with respect and gratitude. The woman somehow caught her gaze, smiled, and winked slightly. Ruth blushed and quickly looked at Connor, who was eating nonchalantly. Well, Ruth thought to herself, let's see if all this change really is for the best. At first, Ruth resisted becoming friends with Connor. She felt this way because, firstly, Connor was a boy, and she believed boys were inherently troublesome, disagreeable, and self-absorbed. Secondly, Ruth was determined to be brave, strong, independent, and self-reliant. She was hesitant to trust a newcomer about whom she knew nothing. She tried everything possible to make Connor understand that they should not be friends. However, any verbal attacks aimed at him seemed to bounce off like a rubber ball hitting a wall. They walked to school together, studied in the same class, and even shared a desk for some lessons. Frankly speaking, few classmates dared to willingly sit with the prickly Ruth, but Connor didn't seem to notice her coldness. Gradually, Ruth began to soften, and before she knew it, they had become friends. She didn't immediately realize how much happier and easier her life had become with the arrival of the red-haired newcomers, Connor and his mother. They seemed to bring with them a sense of joy that had been missing from her home since her parents' divorce. As for Gail, she quickly became friends with Sarah, much faster than her son with Ruth. The women began spending a lot of time together. Sarah was surprised to find that happiness was possible outside of a relationship. "I really sympathize with you," Gail said after Sarah had shared her life story with her. "How are you feeling now?" Sarah shrugged. "You know, it's been awful, especially in our small town when everyone knows each other. It feels like everyone is looking at me when I walk down the street." Gail frowned. "Does that bother you?" "Of course," Sarah replied. "It's difficult to live normally and pretend not to notice the sideways glances and whispers." Gail smiled. "Ultimately, it's your choice, isn't it? To pay attention to people or not. I don't fit the standard look, and I get many stares. Some even dare to share their invaluable opinion about how I should look." Both women laughed. "I always talk about myself," Sarah said, "and I've never once asked about you. That's quite selfish of me." "Oh," Gail shook her head, "please don't speak like that. Taking care of yourself or paying attention to yourself isn't a bad thing. And if you really want to hear my story, then listen to it. I've always had a family of women," Gail began with a smile. "It's like the stories about witches. I don't know all the women in my family, and every generation have somehow always lived alone. My grandmother raised my mom alone. I've never seen my grandfather, but my grandmother never seemed to care that she lived without a husband. She didn't marry my grandfather either, despite the strong disapproval back then. But my grandmother didn't care. What about your mother?" She said something like, "Well, it's your time." My mom studied until the last month of her pregnancy. Then she took a sabbatical. I was born. She stayed home for a year and then went back to her study. Grandma helped her with me. "Did your father try to convince your mom to marry him?" Sarah asked. "Yes, many times. Even when I was a little girl, I often heard these conversations. He remembered her and loved her for many years. I think at one point he was even ready to move in with us. But my mom wouldn't agree. And then when I was about 10 years old, I found out he got married. Now he has 3 children and seems happy. We still communicate." "Well, and your mother didn't marry, did she?" "Yes, neither did my grandmother. She starts dating someone from time to time, but it doesn't last long. Mom says she's like a cat who walks on her own. By the way, my mother, grandmother, and I are very much alike. You would have known that we are a family at first sight. They're not of this world either." Sarah was embarrassed. "I don't think you're weird," Gail shook her head reassuringly. "I don't see anything wrong with being weird. If what's natural to you seems strange to others but doesn't hurt them in any way, what's wrong with that? But for a while, I tried to be normal. When I entered college, I moved away from my mom and granny. I purposely chose a different city and moved into a hostel there. I wanted to be like everyone else, a normal student. Except it's complicated. I was raised by 2 freedom-loving women who did whatever they wanted and allowed me to do the same. There, I met Connor's father at an exhibition of young artists. "Are you a painter?" Gail shrugged. "No, I dabbled in a bit of everything back then, including embroidery and clay modeling. And now, I teach dance, yoga, and I'm a pretty good singer. I'll show you sometime." But we digress from Connor's dad. I came to this exhibition to support my friends and out of curiosity. He was there with other businessmen scouting for young talents to invest in, hoping their paintings would appreciate in value. John is a very wealthy and influential man, 15 years older than me. He took a liking to me instantly. He said my attire was unusual. Gail laughed. I tried not to stand out, but I couldn't shake off my ingrained taste. I wore a multicolored skirt my grandmother made, paired with a plain white top. I even had dreadlocks then, it was the trend. Sarah laughed. Yeah, with that description, you didn't stand out at all. Gail waved her off. Everyone was like that there, art folks always peculiar things. Between John and me, things took off quickly. He was so clever, so intriguing, and most importantly, we understood each other perfectly. It was just wonderful. I thought I had met the man of my dreams, yet I didn't even tell my mom and grandmother about him. Why? Gail shrugged. I don't know. I was afraid their curse would affect me. I feared that if I told them, things would immediately fall apart between JN and me. Then I found out I was pregnant. John was overjoyed. He had wanted kids for a long time and proposed to me right away. John offered to move in with him while the wedding preparations were going on. I agreed. That's when things started to change. Sarah, who had been hoping for a happy ending even though she knew it was unlikely, sighed. What started to change? Gail smiled sadly. I realized that lifestyle wasn't for me. Even my belongings looked out of place in his large, expensive house. It was like uprooting a dandelion from the street, planting it in a flower pot, and placing it in a designer-renovated house. I was completely out of place. I realized I couldn't be myself. I couldn't attend a social event with John with red dreadlocks and a skirt my grandmother sewed. I suddenly realized that even if I tried to fit into society, those attempts would fail. I'm like my mother and grandmother. I don't want to live in a gilded cage. I don't want to be taught which fork to use for prawns or which wine to order with duck. Sarah sighed. And you left him? Gail nodded. For the first time in ages, her face didn't seem filled with sunlight. I talked to John. He persuaded me we could find an arrangement that would suit everyone. He said I could dress and behave however I wanted, furnish the house to my liking, and he wouldn't restrict me in any way. Why did you say no? Gail's smile became sadder. Because it was impossible. It's like asking a fish to live on land. You can water it or feed it, but it won't feel better on dry land. It's what John grew up with, his entire family, his friends, his job. If we continued living together, we have to fight them every day, defending me. I wouldn't wish that on him. The women fell silent for a while. Then Sarah asked, do JN and Connor keep in touch? Gail nodded. Yes, often. They have a good relationship. And do you regret it? No, Gail answered immediately, without a second thought. Our paths crossed for a while, but they were never meant to come along. Besides, regretting the past means losing the present and the future. Sarah pondered her friend's words. It seems that you and your son did not accidentally appear in our lives at this time. Gail chuckled heartily. I believe there are no coincidences, she confessed. A couple of years passed. One day, Ruth went to Connor's house after school as usual and caught him assembling another Lego set. That's impressive. Yeah, I like it too, Connor quietly agreed. It's very relaxing to assemble them. I can spend weeks on it. I feel a bit ashamed that I don't do anything, Ruth confessed. Oh, you shouldn't, Connor smiled. Have you ever had any hobbies? I used to enjoy photography, Ruth revealed. My grandfather had an old camera. It could only take a few dozen shots, which then had to be developed. Do you take photos now? No, well, I've just remembered that, and I thought I might try. But now, I would have suggested a digital camera to you, Ruth sighed. Do you realize how expensive those are? Sure, Mom and Dad could provide some money, but they won't buy such a pricey thing. Connor sat beside her on the bed. You could earn money for it in summer. We can get a part-time job together. Incredulous, Ruth looked at him. Well, we could try. What's the job? So they started working in a coffee shop. Connor could chat with anyone and taught Ruth to do the same. It was he who placed out a jar with a sign for a camera on the counter. Why would you do that? Ruth felt embarrassed. What's the problem? Connor shrugged his shoulders. It's not like it's forced. If someone wants to, they'll leave a tip. And people did leave tips. Not much, but there were also very good days. What kind of camera? A customer once asked. He was a tall, handsome man in his 30s. Ruth was embarrassed, but Connor replied, my friend was a photographer, and now she needs a good camera to continue. The man hesitated. Do you have any sample work? Connor quickly took out some pictures from under the counter. The man examined them, returned them to Connor, and smiling, put a few notes in the jar. Ruth's eyes widened, the man winked at her and left. That's $200, the girl gasped. Connor smiled. See, it's working. Where did you get my photos? Your grandfather gave me a few more. Ruth made a face. She was uncomfortable with the intrusion, but it was working. By the end of the summer, they had earned the money. Ruth wanted to split the tips, but Connor insisted. No, it's all yours. The jar says it's for a camera. But I only need half the money. I know, but you'll use all the money to buy something better, and honestly speaking, my father gives me enough for my needs. Ruth frowned. So you didn't have to work? Did you do it just for me? For the first time, Connor seemed embarrassed, but he had always been honest with her. Yes, I don't need the money, but I wanted the experience. Plus, I'll still have 3 months' salary. Money is always useful. All right, for some reason, the girl didn't push it further. She had a sudden thought that Connor took the job to spend more time with her. Ridiculous, the girl said to herself. Why would he do that? A week later, she picked up her camera, and after snapping her first picture, she realized this was her calling. She could now understand Connor, who spent hours in his room with his construction set. She was eager to explore this newfound hobby. For her birthday, she asked her mother for a book on photography, and she got a comprehensive one, detailing the basics of photography. Now I understand why good pictures are good, and bad ones are bad, she enthusiastically told Connor. All these horizons, perspectives, contrasts, they're not just empty words anymore. I'm glad you found something you enjoy. I think you'll be great at it professionally, Ruth snorted. Oh, stop it. Why not submit your pictures to a contest? No way. I don't know anything yet. It took Connor a year to convince her. She didn't win, but her work was singled out by the jury as the best from a young photographer. This recognition propelled Ruth to delve deeper into photography. I love that you have a hobby, her mother told her, but you should also think about college. Your best friend is into his construction set, but he's also preparing for a finance degree. Ruth frowned. I don't know what I want yet, Mom, but okay, I'll think about it. The girl shared her concerns with Connor. What do you want to do? He asked. She shrugged. I would like to take pictures all my life, but my parents won't be happy with that. Are you sure you want to do what they tell you to do? Ruth sighed. Yes, I'm not ready to go against them. I won't give up photography either, but I need to study something more real. Connor thoughtfully ruffled his red hair. Where can you study without stress? What subjects do you find easy? Literature, you know that. Connor smiled. Maybe you should consider becoming a philologist. That's what they did. Connor pursued finance as he planned, while Ruth began studying philology, albeit without much enthusiasm. Photography remained her primary interest. She regularly submitted her work to competitions, receiving increasing recognition. For instance, a photograph of Grandpa and Leela playing chess won second place in a major competition, earning her a substantial cash prize. She also began taking part-time jobs, doing wedding, Christmas family photo shoots, maternity and newborn shoots, and various thematic ones. Though she wasn't very fond of these. I can't shoot these the way they want, she admitted to Connor. People have preset expectations of what photos should look like. Connor laughed. What do you enjoy shooting? Ruth shrugged. Nature, abandoned buildings, random people. I know that, but I asked about your favorite shoots you do for money. Ruth was deep in thought. Perhaps personalized photo shoots, but only when the client wants something unique and trusts me. I've not had many of those, maybe 2 people in all this time, she sighed and looked at her friend. But, Connor, I can't turn down the work, it's decent money. Otherwise, I'd have to ask my parents. You know I'm afraid I'll get stuck in this job, afraid I'll stop growing. Connor pondered for a moment. You know me, I'm practical. But if I were more romantic, I'd suggest you drop out of college, quit your part-time jobs, and focus on pure art. But, I'm practical, so my advice is simple: finish your degree, keep your part-time jobs, and make the most of them whenever possible. Exercise your creativity. That's great advice. Just be everywhere at one time, excel here and there. I barely have time to date because of work and studies. I can't remember the last time I went to the cinema with a guy. Last Saturday with me. I mean, a real date, Ruth smiled. I understand. I'm not one of the worthy contenders for your heart, answered Connor. Ruth blushed slightly. Connor, stop it. You know what I meant. Back to the point, it seems like your option is the only right one, as I don't want to give up anything yet. That's what I figured. And surprisingly, Ruth managed everything. She got her diploma, which settled her moral debt to her parents, but she never worked today in her specialty. By then, she was making good money as a photographer. Little by little, she started choosing her clients, working with those who trusted her, and got amazing results. For the first time in years, she was able to relax and devote herself entirely to the work she loved. Initially, her parents were skeptical, but she was supported by Connor, Gail, and her younger sister. Unexpectedly, her grandfather sided with her and spoke to Sarah, who, sighing, accepted Ruth's choice to pursue photography, not philology. Ruth also started sorting out her personal life. For years, she had focused only on her studies and work. She even envied Connor. After their talk about her future, he started dating more frequently. The relationships were short-lived, but the number of girlfriends was surprising. Once, Sarah even mentioned to Gail, I never thought a Connor would turn out to be such a ladies' man. He always seemed so calm and serious. I even thought he liked Ruth at one point, and now this sudden change. Gail shrugged her shoulders. I'm not pleased about it myself. I know there are people abundant in love. I've met such people, they sincerely fall in love with everyone they meet. But with my son, it's different. It's as if he's using these girls to cover some pain. Maybe we should talk to him about it, Sarah suggested. He's too adult to take advice. Only time will help here. Connor is a clever boy, he'll realize he doesn't need this. Due to his numerous girlfriends, Connor spent less time with Ruth than before, which upset her. She tried to understand him. Sometimes, he would bring some girls to their gatherings, but this only annoyed Ruth. All the girls were equally annoying to her. They were tall, slender, beautiful, but all equally empty and stupid. Then, Ruth met Matt. They met at an exhibition where her works were displayed. It was opening day, and Ruth was waiting for Connor, but he was late. She called him several times, but he didn't answer. Leela said she'd come tomorrow. Her parents were working, her grandfather was unwell and stayed at home, so Ruth was alone at the exhibition. She looked at her colleagues' works. Some were not to her taste, others intrigued her. After touring the whole exhibition, she stopped at her favorite work. Do you like it? She suddenly heard a man's voice behind her. Ruth turned around. A tall, black-eyed guy was looking at her. He was dressed all in black, with black, curly hair just touching his shoulders. Ruth immediately thought of romantic but slightly sad heroes. I wish I could take a picture of him, a black overcoat in an autumn park. It seems fine, thought Ruth, and then said to the guy, what about you? Very deep and tragic, yes. The lonely figure of a girl in a dark park against the light of a lone lantern. Most of the picture is taken up by the night sky where a huge firework is blossoming. She's alone, watching it like a festivity passing her by. Ruth nodded thoughtfully. How beautifully you described it, as if you knew the photographer, he smiled. Unfortunately, I don't know him or her, but I'd like to meet them. She extended her hand, Ruth to Bolivar. What a meeting, Matt, the young man introduced himself, shaking her hand and pointing to the picture. Did I guess correctly? Ruth smiled, not quite. It's not a silhouette of a girl, it's a dog. If you look closely, you'll see. And she didn't seem sad to me, rather amazed by the firework. It surprised me because animals are usually afraid of loud noises and bright lights, but this dog wasn't. Matt grinned. How foolish I must have looked. No, not really, Ruth admitted, but it was funny. In that case, I'm glad because I've met you, a young, beautiful girl who happens to be a talented photographer. Ruth blushed and smiled. Thank you, that's kind to say. Are you a photographer too? Matt shook his head. Unfortunately, no. I work as a model and an actor. Wow, that's amazing. Could I have seen you somewhere? I don't think so. I'm just a rising star about to ascend. Suddenly, Ruth mustered up the courage to ask, would you agree to be my model if only you agree to have a cup of coffee with me? Then I agree. 20 minutes later, they were already sitting in the cafe. Ruth saw several missed calls from Connor and one message on her phone. Ruth, where are you? I'm here. She read it but didn't reply. Matt seemed to her a very nice and interesting guy. Ruth suddenly felt how wonderful it was to be with a man who looked at her with such adoring eyes, offered compliments, held doors open, made jokes, and asked her out on a date. At their first meeting in the cafe, they agreed on a photo shoot. Everything went so smoothly that Ruth could hardly believe it. She had never worked with professional models before. Matt anticipated her every thought, suggested options. Ruth barely had time to capture the right angles, but she didn't want to stop him. That was great, Ruth exclaimed when it was over. You haven't checked anything yet, Matt chuckled. I already know that, she responded. He suddenly sighed. What's wrong? Ruth asked. I just realized that now I need to come up with another excuse to see you again. The girl blushed and looked down. I can help you with such a problem, Ruth said. Say, we could meet next time so I can show you the finished pictures. Matt pretended to consider this. Well, I suppose that's a good excuse. Deal. A month later, she was roused from sleep by a call from Connor. What do you want? She asked groggily. Oh, how sharp and unwelcoming, Connor retorted. Ruth sighed and sat up in bed. I was still asleep. Wow, it's already 10 in the morning. And what kept you up so late last night? Ruth recalled the previous night, a smile spreading across her face. None of your business, she said. You probably had a girlfriend too. Who's with you now? Polly? Molly? Dolly? Connor disregarded her question. Do you have a boyfriend? Yes, I do. That's news. Why haven't you introduced me? We haven't been dating for long, and by the way, when I haven't seen you in ages, you can't seem to find the time for me between your girlfriends. Ruth, you know very well that I only have one friend, and that's you. The others are just flings. Ruth knew and even smiled involuntarily, but asked sternly, you didn't call me just to chat, did you? What do you want? I just missed you. I wanted to ask if we could meet. That's a great idea. Why don't we make it a double date? After a few seconds of heavy breathing into the receiver, Connor replied, okay, let's do it. The double date was a peculiar experience for Ruth. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but she could sense tension in the air. CLA, Connor's girlfriend, was a stereotypical 19-year-old blonde with massive pink lips, wearing a short blue dress and high heels. Seeing her, Ruth breathed a sigh of relief. He won't be with her for long, Ruth thought. 3 weeks. Max. Connor appeared to act as usual, occasionally smiling, even joking, with his arm around his girlfriend, but Ruth knew him too well. All this time, he had been observing Matt in an analytical way, like an entomologist studying a new insect species. To Ruth, Matt was perfect. He looked handsome, joked, and made a good impression on CLA, speaking with her about his film shoots. Connor watched Matt while Ruth watched Connor. At the end of the evening, Ruth found a moment to speak with her friend. "So, what's your opinion?" she inquired. A narcissistic, pompous show-off, talking about himself all night. "What a bore," taken aback, Ruth retorted. "If he hadn't been talking, there would have been silence. You didn't say a word all evening. I've heard all his stories, so I kept quiet." Are you upset that CLA was so focused on him?" Connor seemed confused. "What does CLA have to do with it anyway?" He conceded, "I don't need to lecture you, you'll figure it out in time." "Exactly," Ruth agreed curtly. "I'll figure it out by myself." "The main thing is for you to be happy," Connor suddenly said, with a hint of sadness and pain in his eyes. "Thank you," Ruth responded. "Thank you for allowing me to date whoever I want, even though I didn't ask." "Good luck with CLA," she added. "Like you don't know me well," Connor replied with a sad grin. "Another 2 or 3 weeks, at the most." "I know you well," thought Ruth, "but sometimes it's as if I don't understand your actions at all." 4 months later, Matt proposed. "Maybe we should start living together?" Ruth greedily said yes. The next day, she shared the news of her moving in with Matt with her mother and younger sister. Finally, Leela responded, "I thought I'd get married before you." "We're just planning on moving in together for now," replied her older sister with a laugh. "I'm happy for you, daughter," said Sarah. "Do you love him?" "Yes," Ruth replied without hesitation, but for some reason, Connor came to her mind at that moment. They had barely seen each other in these 4 months. All she knew was that he had broken up with CLA and was now dating someone else. 6 months later, Matt proposed. Naturally, Ruth said yes. She saw her best friend less and less. She even worried that Connor wouldn't attend her wedding, but he did, accompanied by his latest model girlfriend, whose name Ruth couldn't remember. Each time Ruth glanced at Connor, he was staring at her intensely. He spent the entire celebration sitting at the table, looking pale and tense. She herself couldn't relax either. Ruth attempted to focus on her husband, to hold his hand, to converse with him, but it was almost impossible. Matt was continuously approached by actors, TV presenters, producers. Then Grandpa approached her just as the presenter announced another dance. "Ruth, may I?" He tilted his head and extended his hand, inviting her to dance. Ruth smiled. Of course, how can one reject such a handsome man? Grandpa chuckled. He led her gently and cautiously in the dance. "You look very pale tonight," he voiced softly. "I think the stylist overdid the makeup," Ruth tried to jest. Michael sighed. "Do you remember when you were little? We made an agreement." Ruth smiled. "Yes, to always tell each other the truth," she replied. Grandfather nodded. He didn't say anything else, but it was clear he was awaiting a response from his granddaughter. "I'm scared," she finally admitted. "How can I be certain if I've made the right choice? Maybe today I'm sure I love Matt, but what if in a year or 5 or 20 I realize I don't love him anymore? What do I do then? How do I recover the lost years? How can I be sure I'm not making a mistake when I choose?" Grandpa sighed thoughtfully and, after a moment, replied, "The choice you make is always the right one at the time you make it. None of us can predict the future. We choose what seems best in the present. Currently, you've chosen Matt because he makes you happy. If that changes in the future, so will your choice. The important thing is to follow your heart and remain true to yourself." Ruth hugged him tightly. "I'm so grateful you're always here for me, and I'm grateful to have such a wonderful granddaughter." Ruth was able to relax only on the second day of the honeymoon. Her husband lay beside her on a neighboring sunbed, smiling at her. Husband, what a strange word, thought Ruth, as she admired her ring, and how handsome that looks. I must take a picture of him. Ruth managed to restore her friendship with Connor a year after her marriage. Matt was away on a movie shoot for 3 months. Ruth busied herself with work, walks, and books. On one of her visits to her mother's house, she ran into Gail there, who had remained as radiant, cheerful, and kind all these years. "How's Connor?" Ruth asked casually. "I haven't seen him in a while." "Oh," Gail replied, "he's due here in half an hour. Why don't you join us?" Ruth looked embarrassed. "No, that's not necessary. You two should have some time together." Gail smiled warmly but said nothing. The three of them chatted about other things until Gail made a request. "Ruth, please bring the pie I baked this morning. It should have cooled down by now. I want Sarah to taste it." "Oh," Sarah chimed in, "yes, Ruth, please bring it." "What pie?" Ruth asked, puzzled. "It's on the kitchen table," Gail explained. "Here are the keys." Ruth was surprised at such a request and completely forgot about Connor's imminent arrival. She was searching all over the kitchen for a missing pie when she heard the sound of the door opening and realized what was happening. "Gail's a sly one, and Mom's a good actress. Mom, I'm here," she heard Connor announce. Ruth stepped into the corridor. "Hi," she greeted him. He clearly hadn't expected to see her. "Hi," Connor replied, sounding disgruntled. Ruth noticed that her friend had changed. He seemed more mature, his facial features sharper. Connor had also lost a significant amount of weight and grown a small beard. Ruth smiled at him and suddenly realized she had missed her friend. She quickly stepped forward and hugged him tightly, not giving him a chance to break free or resist. Connor protested at first, then sighed and returned her hug. "What are you doing, Ruth?" he asked in surprise. "I've missed you badly," she answered honestly. "Me too," Connor admitted. They stood there for a full minute. "How did you end up here?" Ruth asked in surprise. "I'm visiting my mom, and your mom is at Ass. She asked me to bring a pie, but I still can't find it." "I started to suspect something," Connor smiled. "Mom's always like that, only interfering when things get extreme. This is precisely the right time. I was beginning to worry that our friendship was on the line." "Me too," Ruth said. "Why don't we make tea, sit down, and talk? Our mothers aren't expecting us, right?" Agreed. Life began to improve. Ruth became a renowned photographer. She no longer had to shoot things she didn't enjoy. She was finally choosing on her own. Her husband was also thriving. He was starring in 2 popular TV series and advertising watches, cologne, and a dating app. Ruth had reservations about the latter. "I don't want to seem jealous," she said to her husband, "but isn't it strange for a married man to advertise a dating app?" Matt laughed and kissed his wife on the cheek. "Sunshine, I'm an actor. Everything I portray is just an image." Despite the logic in her husband's words, she wasn't comfortable with the idea. In general, she found it increasingly difficult to accept that her husband was constantly playing a role. The more they lived together, the more it seemed to Ruth that Matt was more of an image than a living person. It was as if he weren't real most of the time. Even after set, Matt continued to portray the charismatic, captivating man he usually played. At work, he could flirt with women and smile at them, and Ruth could see their eyes light up. This made her angry. As time passed, their relationship began to cool off. Ruth knew that passion didn't last forever, but she was waiting for it to evolve into something calmer and more tender. It didn't. "Maybe you two don't love each other anymore," her younger sister suggested when Ruth shared her concerns. She sighed. "I hope that's not the case. I keep thinking something will change or an event will reignite our spark." Leela suggested, "Maybe you should surprise him." "Surprise?" Ruth was puzzled. "Yes, they say it's good for couples to do something unexpected to rejuvenate their relationship." "I'll think about it," said Ruth. She pondered for a while, even consulting Connor. "Can I come over?" she asked, calling her friend. He seemed less enthusiastic than usual but replied, "Sure, if it's urgent, but I'm not alone. I'm with Maisie." "Is that your new girlfriend?" "Yes, but this time it's different. You'll see." When Ruth arrived, Maisie herself opened the door. She was petite, wore glasses, and had big blue eyes. She smiled warmly at Ruth and gave her a hug. "Hi, it's nice to finally meet you." "I'm glad too," Ruth replied, her chest tightening. The girl didn't match the conventional standards of beauty compared to Connor's previous girlfriends, but her sincerity and genuineness made Ruth realize Connor was serious this time. "Hi," Connor emerged into the corridor. "You wanted to talk? Let's go to the kitchen." "You both go into the living room," Maisie suggested, "and I'll bring some tea and freshly baked cream scones." Connor gently wrapped his arm around her waist, kissing her cheek. "Thank you, darling." For some reason, Ruth felt a pang in her heart. She quickly moved into the living room. After only an hour at Connor's, she had to leave. Seeing Maisie made her lose all thoughts. Connor didn't seem to understand why she wanted to meet so urgently. On her way home, Ruth couldn't pinpoint her feelings. Why couldn't she be happy for her best friend's happiness? "I've thought of a surprise for him," Ruth told her sister over the phone while packing. "I'm going to visit him. We haven't seen each other for a month." "Cool, you're going directly to the set?" "No, Matt wouldn't understand that. I'm going to visit him at the hotel." "Wow, good luck, sister." "Thank you, Leah." Ruth was sure Matt would love it because he loved brightness, spontaneity, boldness, and experimentation. She had thought of everything. She rented a room in the same hotel where Matt was staying and found out when the actors would return from filming. She changed into a maid's costume, which was quite decent by her standards. It was a short black dress with a puffy skirt, a lace apron. Ruth was nervous. Her room was on the other end of the floor. It was a brave task to walk the entire corridor dressed like that. After gathering her courage, she thought of Matt's reaction and decided to go. She was lucky to meet no one in the corridor. By the time she reached the room, her legs had stopped trembling. Ruth knocked on the door and tried to change her voice. "Cleaning. Who does cleaning at this hour?" she thought. "Well, at least he'll open the door out of curiosity." Her expectations were met. The door opened, revealing a beautiful young girl with wet hair wearing only a towel. Ruth was taken aback. "Oh, I probably have the wrong room," Ruth started but was interrupted by Matt's voice from inside. "Sunshine, who's there?" "A maid," the girl shouted back. "Ask her to come back later." Sunshine turned to Ruth, who managed to force a smile. "I'll come back later. Have a splendid evening ahead." Ruth turned around, and the door closed behind her. Ruth couldn't recall how she ended up in her room. She sat on the bed for a long time, striving to gather her thoughts. She had no memory of how she had made it home. Feeling the need to share her experience, she considered her options. Connor would have been her go-to before, but now she pictured Maisie, sweet and gentle at his house, receiving affection from Connor like no other girlfriend before. For some reason, she didn't feel like approaching her mom or sister either. That left her grandfather. He hugged her tightly upon her arrival. He didn't let on that he suspected something was wrong, though he was slightly proud that Ruth had come to him for help. He didn't rush her, keeping a watchful eye on her. "The tea's ready," he announced, placing a cup before her. They drank in silence. When Ruth poured their second cup, she finally told him about her husband's cheating. Michael listened attentively, without interruption or unnecessary questions. When she finished, he asked, "What do you feel now?" "I don't know," she responded. "What should I feel? Anything? Bitterness? Resentment? Regret? Relief? Anger? The important thing is to put it into words. I feel betrayed and foolish, but also, strangely enough, relieved. It's as if I've been tormented by a mystery that I couldn't solve. Now that I know what it is, I feel relieved. Do you want to forgive him?" She shook her head vehemently. "Absolutely not." "Are you going to get a divorce?" "Yes, but I doubt that's enough." Her eyes sparkled as she forcefully sliced a piece of cake. Her grandfather smiled. "Not enough, I think. I'm beginning to recognize my granddaughter, Ruth. Matt loves grand gestures. I think it's only fair that I give him one last grand gift. Do you have an idea yet? Michael asked. Yes, I do. When Ruth shared her plan, her grandfather laughed. It's a great idea, but are you sure you're ready to spend your time and energy on such a plan? I'm ready, she said with pure determination in her voice, and then I can say goodbye to him once and for all. Over the next month, Connor barely saw his friend and couldn't comprehend her sudden change. One instant she seemed eager to share something with him, the next she abruptly withdrew. He couldn't think of anything he had said or done to offend her, nor could he imagine Maisie saying anything to upset Ruth. Maisie was the first girl in years who had stirred warm feelings in him. She was good, kind, and sensitive. She loved and cared for him deeply. He wondered if over time he could reciprocate her feelings as strongly. After all, he couldn't forever harbor feelings for Ruth, could he? He always hoped that she would see him as more than a friend, but that never happened. He tried to forget her, but it proved futile. When he met other girls, he always quickly realized that he didn't feel anything for them. When Ruth married, any glimmer of hope he clung onto was extinguished. He disliked her husband Matt, who seemed deceitful. He was handsome and brilliant, but Connor saw him as a scoundrel. He wondered how Ruth, usually so perceptive, could look at Matt with such adoration. But if she was happy, he decided he wouldn't interfere. Meeting Maisie eased his pain a little, giving him a reason to engage with life again. He hadn't forgotten Ruth, he never could. But Maisie offered him warmth, care, and support. And now that he'd finally come to terms with it, Ruth reappeared, stirring his life, only to disappear again. For an entire month, she didn't respond to any of his calls or texts. Connor, I'm fine, don't worry, she reassured him. Why don't you tell me what's happening? I'm worried, he asked. Later, Ruth replied, you'll see for yourself. This vague explanation left Connor dissatisfied, pacing around his house, trying to figure out what was going on. He noticed Maisie's concerned gaze. He felt like he didn't deserve her. Although he hadn't mentioned Ruth to Maisie, she seemed to understand. At the end of the month, a message from Ruth caught him off guard. Hi, I invite you and Maisie to come to my first solo exhibition. It's this Saturday at 3 p.m. Interesting, Connor muttered. When Ruth first conceived her solo exhibition, she couldn't have foreseen the personal nature of the theme. She had been mulling over different ideas for years, from abandoned parks to the city's oldest buildings to random passers-by. She never expected to choose a theme so close to her heart. Her good friend Dagny, an experienced organizer of successful exhibitions, was instrumental in helping her. I'm sure it will be a pharaoh, Dagny declared when she saw the pictures. Ruth grinned, that's what I'm counting on. Her friend coughed awkwardly, but are you sure you're ready for it? After the opening, there's no turning back. I warn you. Ruth pressed her lips together tightly, I'm sure. That's precisely how I want to end things. Dagny snorted suddenly, okay. In a way, I can understand you. I think many of our viewers will relate to this topic too, Dagny declared. Yes, unfortunately. Is anyone coming to support you? Ruth nodded. Yes, my mom, my younger sister and her boyfriend, my grandfather, and my best friend and his girlfriend. Ruth's voice trembled at the last words. That's great. Will your husband be alone? Ruth smiled. No, he'll have almost the whole film crew with him. I had to persuade him, but it's worth it. Work colleagues, then Dagny said thoughtfully, yes, I see your point. Matt had just returned from a film shoot. The exhibition was due to start in a few hours. He was surprised when his wife told him about such an event. Why didn't you tell me before? I was preparing a surprise, replied Ruth. You like surprises, don't you? I love surprises, but I think I'm going to be tired, her husband sighed. Don't worry, I need your support just for the opening and bring the whole film crew with you. There'll be wine and snacks. Matt laughed. I don't know if they'll want to, but you persuade them, his wife asked sweetly. You always say that such events are useful. And by the way, There are many personal pictures in this exhibition, she added quietly. Wow, you mean it's going to be about me? Matt asked in an excited voice. He laughed. Then I'll definitely bring everyone. Okay, dear. Matt did not have an opportunity to meet his wife before the exhibition started. When he got home, Ruth wasn't there. He quickly jumped into the shower, shaved, and put on his best suit. I wonder what Ruth's up to, surely something cute and unique. She's very talented, there's no denying that. In general, Ruth is a lovely woman. It's just a pity that we sometimes don't agree on some things, he sighed. I should also ask Wendy not to hang on me in front of my wife. Matt went into the hall and saw the title of the exhibition, Love Story. The first photograph hung there. Ruth took it after the first night they spent together. He's hugging her from behind, and she's taking a picture of them in the mirror. Nice shot, he heard Wendy's voice from behind him. It even looks like you love her here. Matt looked around. Fortunately, there was nobody standing close to them, and there was no one to hear. I did, then Matt replied. And who knows, maybe I still love her. Wendy grinned lightly, running her fingers along his arm. But all these months, during filming, every night in your hotel room, you've been saying the opposite, she purred. He smiled. Don't play with my heart like that, sweetheart. You know I won't surrender you to her, she added, and clawed at his wrist. Matt looked around anxiously. People were arriving. If Wendy continued to behave this way, they would certainly be suspected. You remember our agreement, don't you? He said. Let's act like just colleagues. And what if I don't? The girl pouted. Maybe I'm tired of hiding. Maybe I want your wife to know everything. Her words sent a chill down Matt's spine. He did not want to lose his wife. I love Ruth. All these actresses, models, casual admirers over the years are empty. Even Wendy, only Ruth interests me, only she is worthy of being my wife, he thought. Suddenly he caught someone else's gaze. It was Connor. Let's go look at the other pictures, Matt said to Wendy. She smiled, nodded cordially, and walked beside him. Each new photo revealed their love story with Ruth. These were pictures from their first photo shoot. How hard he had tried. You look great here, Wendy said thoughtfully. No other photographer could capture your beauty like this. Your wife is talented. I can't deny that, the man nodded. There weren't many pictures of him with Ruth, mostly his portraits and random shots. He hadn't noticed her taking his pictures so often. With peripheral vision, Matt saw the guests' reactions to the photos. They recognized him. This exhibition was a tribute to him, a declaration of love from his talented wife. Then there were photos from their honeymoon, then came shots of everyday family life. Ruth captured him rehearsing monologues, choosing shirts for auditions, brushing his teeth. Every photo expressed the photographer's love for the subject. Matt sensed Wendy's discomfort viewing the pictures. It's okay, let her see how much he is loved. Even if she leaves him, it won't matter. The main thing is she mustn't tell his wife anything, Matt thought. But in the next room, the mood changed. He looked different in the photos. Cold, distant, frowning. Perhaps that's how he had been with her lately. It's okay, he'll make it right. Ruth loves him so much, he'll definitely take a holiday and spend time with her. She deserves it. Their relationship will be as joyous and vibrant as it was on their honeymoon. Then he entered the last hall. It was the most populated. He and Wendy had to squeeze through the visitors to reach the photos. Matt froze. It was him and Wendy in the pictures. He turned his head, and his partner looked at him fearfully. Everyone is looking at us, she whispered. He couldn't comprehend when Ruth had managed to film this. The events captured in their photographs had transpired recently, not more than a month ago. Is that your wife? Wendy suddenly asked. I saw her in the hotel. Matt looked up, and the center picture was Ruth alone, taking a mirror selfie. It was similar to a picture at the beginning of the exhibition, but this time only Ruth was in the frame, calm and cold. She had seen his infidelity. I must find my wife and talk to her, he said, scanning the room. Ruth's mother and sister were nearby, along with her grandfather. He spotted Connor, and unexpectedly, the redhead did not look at him with contempt or triumph, but pity. Thinks he's beaten me? No way. Finally he noticed his wife. Ruth. What is this? His wife looked at him calmly. He saw no anger, hatred, or signs of recent tears, only indifference. Didn't you read the title? She asked. It's written at the entrance, a love story. Matt mumbled. Ruth nodded, and as has ended today. Connor couldn't sleep until morning. Back at home, Connor took a quick shower and pretended to sleep. Maisie left him alone, turned off the light, and settled on her own side of the bed. Ruth knows everything now. She's finally realized what kind of man her husband is. They will surely part their ways. But why should I care? Of course, as a friend, I'll always support her. But is that the point? And besides, how could he think of Ruth now, with Maisie beside him? Sweet, kind, gentle, loving Maisie. She loves me as much as I love Ruth. I can't betray her. He eventually fell asleep and woke up at lunchtime, his head throbbing. Maisie was gone. His attention was drawn to the half-open cupboard door. He looked inside and rushed into the kitchen. Maisie was there, writing on a large piece of paper. Maisie? Connor asked, surprised. What's going on? She looked up and smiled softly. I'm leaving you. But why? What happened? She smiled again. I know you've been in love with your best friend for years. Connor shook his head desperately. Maisie, I swear I've never cheated on you. I know it's not that. I'm just tired of being second best. She raised her hand to stop him from speaking. It's not your fault. It was clear to me from the beginning. Only someone who loves unrequitedly can understand someone else who feels the same. But you chose to be with me, and that made me happy. I thought I could wait for you as long as it takes. I thought my love could reach your heart. It did, Connor. I know that you treat me well, that you're ready to make me your wife and live with me all your life. You're a good man, I know. But you don't look at me the way you look at her, and I don't want to spend my only life constantly thinking about it. It'll be hard for me at first, but I'm sure I'll meet someone who will love me just as much. Connor sighed. You're wonderful, she smiled. Thank you. Tell her how you feel. Maisie stood up, hugged him tightly, then kissed him on the cheek. She picked up her suitcase from the corridor and carefully closed the door behind her. Connor slowly sank into a chair. A few days later, he went to visit his mother, carrying a lot on his mind. As a child, it seemed to him that his mother knew the answers to everything, so he was surprised that as an adult she always gave him a choice, never persuaded or insisted, and accepted any decision he made. I'm so tired and confused, Mom, Connor said. I know, sunshine. I know, she said soothingly. They sat in the kitchen of the flat they had moved into years ago. Get some sleep, son, Gail suddenly said. When you wake up, you'll know what to do next. Connor yawned, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. His mother walked him to his childhood room, and he went to bed. He dreamt of a spring day when he and Ruth, both around 12 years old, were launching paper boats on puddles. Connor looked at her and thought she was the most beautiful girl in the world. Connor, Ruth asked him, will our ship sink again? Connor shook his head confidently. No, Ruth, it won't sink. They carefully placed the boat into the cold spring water. The boat rocked slightly but stayed afloat. Connor smiled. Connor, someone shook him by the shoulders. Connor opened his eyes and saw Ruth's smiling face above him. You sleep just like you did when you were a child, she said to him with your hand under your head. Well, yes, he said confusedly, wiping his eyes. What are you doing here? She shrugged her shoulders oddly. Seems like we have something to talk about. She suddenly leaned in and kissed him. Connor forgot how to breathe, then gently put his arms around her and drew her closer. Yes, definitely, they wanted to talk about the same thing. Thank you for joining us today on Deep Stories. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video.